My aspiration, my hope has been to try to help humanity evolve. What that's led me to do is think in terms of networks. Think in terms of how people are connected, how we find each other, how we trust each other, how we communicate, how we navigate life together. And that has been, in a sense, my life's mission.
Reid Hoffman is an icon of Silicon Valley.
He's always thinking about things in very large scale.
We live in an age that overwhelms us in choices, from the minuscule to the monumental.
How much of the world will this touch? How much will it change things?
It's like being trapped in a carnival attraction that combines a bounce house and a hall of mirrors.
He's the one example of a nice guy winning.
He created LinkedIn, which has really changed the way people find jobs and network.
This uncertainty poses challenges that can leave the most experienced of managers scratching their head.
He was an early employee at PayPal, which changed the way people pay for things.
He's also one of the most thoughtful people I've ever met in terms of just thinking about the world.
As a switched-on listener of this podcast, you likely look on general labels such as millennial with a large dose of skepticism.
He is someone who always thinks, how do I create incentives for other people to be brave, to step out, to say the unpopular thing, to do the harder thing?
I was born August 5th, 1967. I was born in the Stanford Hospital when my father was a law student at Stanford. This was, of course, during the kind of turbulence around Vietnam.
The issue here became the right to protest, and it all seemed quite removed from the war in Vietnam.
Dad likes to joke. I was participating in demonstrations and running from tear gas even before I could walk because I was, of course, a kid in my parents' arms.
Reid has a very strong sense of social justice, which I think also sets him apart in Silicon Valley.
One of the things in business that I tend to be known for is strategy. And they say, well, how did you learn your strategy? And the answer was board games and fantasy role-playing games. My first paycheck was actually, in fact, a check for doing editorial work at a fantasy role-playing game called RuneQuest that was produced by a game company called the Chaosium. I just basically walked in the door with my friend to start talking to the people working there, and I still remember they're slightly like, oh God, here's this young kid. What do we do with him?
You can just picture him, a 12-year-old, really eager, slightly obsessed, super smart kid who just loves this game.
And then what I'd done is they had published something, and so I went through it with a red pen about how I would change it and all the kinds of things I would do. And I brought it in, I handed it to Steve Perrin. He goes, oh, would you like to work on something else?
He is always going to seek out a perspective or an experience that will round him out as a human being.
When he talks about Putney, he talks about learning to be a good person and learning to be a good citizen, not just being good at calculus.
The Putney School was fascinated me. It was drive oxen through the woods and kind of do blacksmithing and woodworking and all these things that I'd never had experience with before. So I applied and got in without my parents knowing. And then what I did is after I got in, I went to my dad and I said, okay, I'd like to go to the Putney School. And he's like, oh, that's fine. Wait a minute, where is that? I was like, Vermont. He's like, all right, let's talk about this a little bit. And so we had a conversation. And one of the things with both my parents being lawyers is from a very early age, whenever I wanted something, I'd have to make a case.
You can definitely see in Reid that he grew up in an environment that cultivated some aspect of debate.
Of course, I was a kid, and I go to this school, and I just think, oh, boarding school, that sounds fun. I get to be independent. And boarding schools are a lot like Lord of the Flies.
He had to stand up for himself and learn how to stand his ground against bullies, much tougher people.
As challenging environments go, those crucibles also help shape you. They help you go, okay, how do you actually, in fact, overcome challenges, overcome difficulty? The first year of boarding school was probably one of the hardest years of my life, but also I think it was one of the most instructive. I don't know if this is true for everyone, but for me, my real personal identity really blossomed when I got to Stanford. A lot of my really close friends are people that I met at Stanford.
We were both in a then brand new program at Stanford called Symbolic Systems, which combined philosophy, programming, logic, computer science, psychology into one new major. And so it was the reinvention of AI, if you like.
If you look at Reid's sort of educational path, what he chose to study and how he chose to study it, you really see someone who is coming at the complexity of the world that we live in today with a really deep foundation of philosophy.
Stanford had such an impact on my trajectory that I literally don't know what the alternative would look like, what that alternative world would look like, because I wouldn't have understood entrepreneurship. I wouldn't have understood software. I might not even become a technologist if I hadn't gone to Stanford.
He started building a really, like, this amazing network of people who were thinking about how humans and technology work and how they interact with each other.
He also met Peter Thiel, who ended up being a very important connection for him.
You've agreed more than disagreed. What is something you strongly disagree about?
Peter Thiel and Reid Hoffman are very different in terms of their political approach to their world. But from what I understand, Reid always liked to interact with people who were different than him.
I think he doesn't have a myopic view. I mean, he really likes to see the forest for the trees, and he's got friends from different parts of the world.
I met him at Oxford, at least he was at Oxford 22 years ago. Many people don't actually know this. He was studying philosophy.
Early on, he wanted to be a philosophy professor. He thought, I have ideas on the world and I want to be a public intellectual. I want to share those ideas. Perhaps academia is the right way to do it.
The thing that I realized within 3 to 6 months of being at Oxford was it was a scholarly pursuit, not a public intellectual pursuit. And so I was like, oh, no, I actually want to have a much broader canvas.
He wanted to take the ideas that were so appealing to him as a student of philosophy, and he wanted to bring them to the masses.
It was thinking back to my time at Stanford, where it was like, oh wait, software is this new medium by which we interact with each other, by which we kind of parse the universe. I could go work in that. And so I called Stephen Heck, and he said, maybe you should go work at Apple.
Today, Apple is hemorrhaging money, and its stock price has plummeted.
This was the dark era when Apple was down and out, shrinking market share. They're making products that were frankly not great during those years.
You know, he was at Apple early. He worked on a thing called eWorld, which, as everyone knows, is Apple's big social network, but nobody knows that because nobody used it.
One of the things that I learned from Apple also was that I really wanted to build a new product from the ground up, to really see if I could do something that would really make a huge difference in people's lives by reconceptualizing what you're doing. So my very first company was called SocialNet.
SocialNet, his first pre-LinkedIn startup, was about how do you form connections? How do you bring people together around common interests?
He was certainly ahead of his time in terms of understanding the power and the value of connecting people within a digital context.
He understood network effects before it had a name.
And SocialNet was a dating service, it was a professional networking service, it was roommates, it was sports partners like golf or tennis.
For the time, that was a very radical idea.
Kind of like he was an entrepreneur before people could spell entrepreneur.
It was probably 1996 or 97, so it was a social network that was on the early edge of the internet.
Part of what I learned from SocialNet was, actually, in fact, we're all trying to navigate our real world lives. We're not trying to go to cyberspace. We're trying to have a really rich and interesting life where we live, where we work. And so your real identity, your real relationships, and improving that and navigating the world around you, that was the key thing.
If you think about that era, what was very hot at that time was the Palm Pilot PDAs and having a Rolodex and address book of friends on your device. And Reid was the first to realize it's not the names, the places, the addresses. It's the relationships that matter.
Starting a company is jumping off a cliff and assembling the airplane on the way down. And what you're realizing after you've jumped off this cliff, after you said, hey, we're gonna go start this new thing, is, oh, I don't have a lot of the parts. I need new people to help me with this. And I don't know what order to assemble this plane in. A good friend of mine from Stanford, Peter Thiel, calls me and says, hey, we have this great idea, it's encryption on mobile phones. And I say, well, that's a terrible idea, but you're a very good friend of mine, so I'll come help you with this. This is the company that later became known as PayPal. There's a way of thinking about startups, which is I've never learned so much except for maybe between the ages of 2 and 3. It's because at the end of every week, there were things that I wish I knew at the beginning of the week. So PayPal launches, and we think, oh, we have this mobile payment solution. We do this whole financing around by transferring money on the Palm Pilot. It's a mobile company, very early mobile first. And all of a sudden, these eBay sellers start using the product. And for the first week, everyone's like, oh, who are these people? We should get them off our service. They're not our customers. Then I was like, wait a minute. These are the people using our product. These are our exact customers. And we pivoted entirely away from focusing on Palm Pilots to email payments through eBay using PayPal.
He was the wolf. I mean, he was the fixer.
I very quickly became Peter Thiel's firefighter-in-chief.
Everything that went wrong, he went to try and fix.
Which was, make sure eBay doesn't drive us off the service. Make sure Visa doesn't shut us down. Persuade the federal government that it's okay that we're not a bank.
It was a true disruption of a very established, very regulated industry, right? Payments, banking. And they were doing things that didn't fit an existing category.
I remember we had breakfast one time. He said, I have to leave at 8:30 because I got to get on a plane to New York to go talk to Elliot Spitzer, the Attorney General of New York, who's suing PayPal for basically anti-money laundering type things. And he's like, I just got to go fix this. And here's how I'm going to fix it, because New York was convinced that PayPal was being used for gambling and all sorts of other things at the time.
He's confident, and he doesn't back down from a fight, and he's very strategic. I mean, the man plays German board games for fun.
He learned so much in terms of risk-taking, how to build teams, how to make the right decisions, especially when faced with existential crises as a company, which every startup goes through.
It was fun, because part of what ends up happening is you say, all right, well, what's a bank? Like, what defines a bank? How do I persuade them? I've never talked to a regulator before. All right, let me go figure out how this looks.
It really can be quite thrilling to talk to Reid because his mind works so quickly and he connects dots so quickly and in such an unexpected way.
He's really able to focus on the things that matter and let other things like burn.
There was a whole set of fires at PayPal where if you didn't solve them, value of the company zero, out of business.
Their customer numbers had grown so exponentially that they could not keep up with customer service, and they actually just made the decision that that was a fire they weren't going to fight at that moment.
So he's able to say, here's the 1, 2, 3 top priorities, everything else I'm not going to worry about right now, because if I get these 3 things right, everything else will be okay.
If eBay had turned us off, if we were no longer to operate on eBay, no initial users, no traction, no network effect, no ability to grow.
Because eBay had its own payment system that was competing with PayPal, and PayPal was winning. And so I think those got very complicated, and eBay very much didn't want to have to buy PayPal, and eventually but they felt like they had to.
We know these guys very well, obviously, because so much of their business is, in fact, on eBay. The synergies of putting these two companies together were incredibly outstanding, and it just seemed like the right time to get this deal done.
Reid was able to marshal the support of PayPal users to help make the case to eBay of PayPal's importance to them. And that really is actually a quite magnificent jiu-jitsu move.
That was the inflection point in my career. That was the thing that made me learn all of these key lessons about how you do consumer internet companies. Not only how do you learn how not to fail, but how do you learn to succeed? And the network, the so-called PayPal Mafia, which I refer to as the PayPal network, was instrumental in figuring out what the next phase of Web 2.0 was.
Everyone looks at it as like, oh, the PayPal Mafia, they were so amazing, that must have been so fun. That was a really hard company. I mean, he doesn't start easy things.
You were part of the PayPal Mafia, is what we call people like you, Elon Musk, the YouTube guys.
All of those people went on to do amazing other things, YouTube and Tesla and LinkedIn, and I mean, so many major other things.
PayPal created fortunes for a handful of very important men in Silicon Valley.
You're not just creating a company, you're creating a generation of entrepreneurs.
Now, initially I was going to take a year off, but then I looked around and I realized Silicon Valley had gone crazy, that everyone had thought the consumer internet was over. This was 2002, and I went, they're wrong. Oh, I can't take a year off. I'll take 6 weeks off, and then I'll come back, and I'll start the company that I've been thinking about, LinkedIn.
Some people need to rest to be re-energized. I think Reid fuels himself through ideas. And LinkedIn was an idea that Reid had been turning over in his mind for a long time.
You know, his sense was, you know, we have these resumes, we have these connections that are hard to see. If I can go use the web and connect people virtually, that unlocks the power and kind of makes real these things that are in everybody's heads right now.
Like, how do you use this to navigate your work and your career? And when I first started telling a bunch of my network about this idea, I basically got the, oh, that'll never work.
I remember thinking, I have this high quality network, why would I make it available to everybody else? And he's like, well, could you just do it? And I said, fine, I'll sign up to LinkedIn. And I was like, you know, number 7 or 9 or 12 or something on the service.
I think some of the biggest challenges that Reid and the initial founders of the company faced were how to reach critical mass and how to scale.
It took a long time to get going. You know, the first 4 or 5 years were quite dicey.
I remember thinking it's kind of messy, but it's a really good, but I still think it's kind of messy, and I still think it's a good idea.
Once we began to get to network density, once we began to see the kind of use cases where people could transform what their economic opportunities are, or how entrepreneurs could use it to pull businesses together, or how venture capitalists would look at it in order to do reference checking on entrepreneurs, we knew we had something. And at that point, it was something. It's just a question of how big.
LinkedIn co-founder Reid Hoffman tells me that in this competitive global environment, there's more demand than ever for social and business networks.
When your design is meh and you're still slaying, you're onto something.
The big story right now is that IPO from LinkedIn. The shares are up 87%.
The press that was generated after we went public was sustained for much longer than we anticipated, and really helped take the brand to the next level.
Reid felt that the idea of the network could now live on in a large company.
And we decided that it was worth taking up time to talk to other companies to see whether or not combination would make sense.
Microsoft acquiring LinkedIn this morning. Microsoft will acquire LinkedIn for $196 per share. It's an all-cash transaction.
And we ended up combining with Microsoft, because Microsoft had this, how do we make all the world's organizations productive? And we had a, how do you transform individuals' career paths, and how do you make individuals productive? I am looking forward to this new inflection and what I can be doing, because now, past just having 430 million members, this is a path to the billions of active members. That was kind of one of those investment decisions where you went, oh yes, we should definitely do this.
In a world of Silicon Valley where everyone's always on a million devices, Reid Hoffman's very interested in making sure he's focused. He's very much present, no matter who he's in a meeting with.
When I'm getting ready to go to a lunch, go to a breakfast, go to a dinner, have a meeting, I actually put a little bit of thought into, oh, this would be good to talk about, this would be good to talk about, this would be good to talk about. And I have a list of that.
Yeah, he juggles so much. I think it's probably the only way that he can operate is by having all of these lists.
His list is always way longer than mine, by the way, because he's got a lot of things that he's working on.
I'll get together with him and be like, okay, so I have these, 8 things I want to talk to you about, and it looks to me like it's a list he's been holding on to for 6 weeks.
I'd hate to imagine what his actual master list looks like.
The bar is so high. I mean, here's somebody who's done so much and is committing himself to doing more. Like, he's not chilling on the beach somewhere. He's committing himself to spreading ideas.
Our next guest is known as the startup whisperer of Silicon Valley. We want to welcome him to the table. Reid Hoffman is here, co-founder.
Reid is one of those people who came to investing, I think, naturally. He's so curious, so he makes lots of little bets.
As part of my days at LinkedIn, one of the people I'd helped was this entrepreneur named Sean Parker. And Sean calls me and he says, oh, there's this really awesome startup that you really need to invest in called Facebook. And I'm like, I'm aware of it. It's great. It's in Boston. He's like, no, they've rented a house out here. You need to meet them.
Reid has invested in nearly every company that's gone from 0 to a gazillion.
What was clear was that Facebook had an awesome product market fit, that when they turned on a college campus, within 6 weeks, 80% of the students in the campus were using it more than 6 times a day.
Harvard didn't have a Facebook, so that's the gap that we were trying to fill. And now we're at 100,000 people, so who knows where we're going next.
That was kind of one of those investment decisions where you went, oh yes, we should definitely do this.
Reid loves being an investor because it allows him to touch so many different sectors, so many different companies.
Walking down a hall with him now is hard. I have been in those venues with him where just everybody's walking up to him to pitch him something. And fair enough. For a long time, he was like the man with the golden touch in Silicon Valley.
So I would invest in the kind of networks and the kinds of companies that as people got into them, the value was added to their life by the other people also in the network. So this ranged anything from Flickr and photo sharing, to Last.fm for music sharing, to Zynga for game playing.
He's able to see around corners, and he's able to see things before they actually happen. And that kind of vision, whether you're an investor or a founder, can be extraordinarily valuable.
And Greylock gave him an opportunity to broaden that, to bring his expertise to other great ideas, other great companies.
The interesting thing about Greylock, it is really a venture capital firm that is set up to the benefit of entrepreneurs.
One of the things I was very lucky about in my first investment at Greylock is these 3 guys of this then tiny company called Airbnb come in to meet with me. And I knew within 2 minutes of their pitch, this is one of the things I want to invest in.
He's a good spotter of trends early as to things before they become, the thing that everybody else is talking about.
We're in an Airbnb, and it's part of how you hope to see the world transform, which is more local and cultural connections as people travel around the world.
Hoffman's Greylock Partners was actually one of the early investors in Airbnb. They are now growing past a $10 billion valuation.
I didn't know for sure, but I knew if it worked out, it'd be amazing.
Reid Hoffman doesn't think of his investments as passive. He knows if he's going to put money into a company, he's also going to put in his own human capital.
The goal is to actually shine a light that's actually useful to everybody. I approach my impact investments very similarly to how I do my commercial investments, which is I look at a great scale mission, an interesting application of a technology or product or service, and a world-class entrepreneur.
Reid is one of the only funders that I have learned through real experience you absolutely have to be 100% honest with. And when you say, this didn't work and here's why, he spends a few minutes making sure you really understood it and asking some deep questions, and then goes, great, you learned.
He's been incredibly influential in Silicon Valley as an entrepreneur, as an investor.
So with Code for America, they said, hey, we have this idea for how do we build fundamental products that can help all of the governments, but we need a big chunk of cash in order to do this. And I was like, great, I'll do it.
That's not how a lot of the world works. It's certainly not how traditional fundraising works.
One of the funny things that happened is I started doing some of the public intellectual stuff that I had as that original idea. I said, actually, in fact, I'm learning all these things about how to start companies, how to scale companies, how to navigate the world of work. Well, we should write about them. We should write these books, Startup Review, Alliance, Blitzscaling. We should do a podcast, Masters of Scale. And the idea of it being any different didn't even occur to most people. This idea sounds hellish to the modern mind, but it had its advantages. And the reason I do this is to try to get these ideas out to other people, this information to help their lives. It isn't actually, it's a hobby really. It's a philanthropic activity.
From the outside, it looks like Reid's doing a bajillion things all the time, and like different domains, different spheres, different influences. But at core, Reid believes in entrepreneurship and agency of people to change the world.
He's so smart about many different things.
He founded the world's most valuable and largest professional network, and that's really, to a large extent, a manifestation of who he is.
I don't actually look at it as breaking the rules. I look at it as trying to redefine the rules.
I believe that Reid's entire life has been an exercise in impact.
And I don't know what's next.
What I hope for and what I work for is a society, a set of networks by which we make each other better.
And he's really had this desire, I think his whole life, to make the world a better place.
We learn how to improve ourselves and each other through connection, through dialogue, through collaboration, through working together.
And it may be that he has just a massive influence on the future of AI, or a massive influence on, I don't know, something else that maybe we haven't even thought of yet.
The set of technologies, services that I want to build are those things that allow us to become our better selves as we help each other do so.